Imagine one night, sirens blaring across the sky, people scrambling down into shelters, and in just a few minutes, the future of all humanity hanging over a single button, not a Hollywood movie, but reality for nearly half a century, a time when just one wrong decision by the United States or the Soviet Union could wipe out civilization. That was the world of the Cold War, a war without formal declarations, without armies clashing head-on, but more chilling than any war film you have ever seen. If you think the Cold War is only about international politics, remember this: from the frozen, shell-torn Korean peninsula, the burning forests of Vietnam, to the fall of the Berlin Wall in thunderous cheers, all of it pressed directly onto the lives of hundreds of millions of people, including Vietnam itself. This is not just a story of two superpowers fighting for influence, but a story of nuclear fear, of mothers waiting for children who never came home, of young Americans stepping for the first time into a distant country called Vietnam and lying forever in its soil. In this video, you will follow a complete journey from the moment World War II had just ended and the world had no time to breathe before stepping into a new confrontation, to Korea, the first test, Vietnam, the deepest wound in the American soul, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the whole planet held its breath, then the years when the Soviet Union weakened and the red flag was finally lowered from the Kremlin. Each stage is not just dry dates and events, but feelings, choices, mistakes, sacrifices of both leaders and ordinary people dragged into the wheels of history. If you watch this video to the end, you will understand why the United States today plays such a special role, why their decisions in Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and beyond still shape the world we live in, why even though the Cold War ended more than 30 years ago, the world has never truly escaped its shadow. This is not just fun history, but a mirror forcing us to look again at war, peace, power, and the price paid for ambition. If you want to understand how modern America was forged, want to know why Vietnam lay in a painful but central position on the Cold War chessboard, want to see how a single wrong decision could push the entire world to the brink of extinction, then this is a story you cannot abandon halfway. Stay until the very last minute, because sometimes, to understand the present, we must trace back to those moments when humanity itself once held its breath, waiting for a future that might not have belonged to it. After the last cannon blasts of World War II faded over the ruined cities of Europe and Asia, it seemed as if humanity could finally breathe after a nightmare. But even before the smoke over Berlin, Tokyo, and Hiroshima had cleared, while American soldiers were still on their way home, a new confrontation was quietly taking shape. On the world map, two colors were becoming more and more distinct. On one side, the capitalist world led by the United States. On the other, the socialist world centered on the Soviet Union. People called this period the Cold War. Cold because the two superpowers avoided direct large-scale conflict, but in reality, a burning war of ideology, weapons, intelligence, and proxy conflicts stretching across the planet. Tension did not start from zero. Between the United States and the Soviet Union, there had already been a thick layer of suspicion before World War II. Right after the October Revolution of 1917, the United States and Western countries intervened against the young Bolshevik government. In the eyes of American leaders, communism was a direct challenge to the democratic capitalist model they believed was humanity's future. In the eyes of Soviet leaders, the capitalist world was an encircling enemy, always trying to strangle the socialist fortress. During World War II, the two sides became allies because they both fought fascism, but it was an alliance in appearance more than in heart, full of mutual distrust. When the war ended, those cracks burst open. Europe was devastated, millions dead of hunger, cities in ruins, factories silent. Who would rebuild the continent, and on what model? The United States launched the Marshall Plan with billions of dollars in reconstruction aid, but with the condition that recipient countries tie themselves to the free market system and political alignment with the West. The Soviet Union wanted to build a security belt by installing friendly regimes in Eastern Europe. Each side feared the other expanding, yet also sought to expand its own sphere of influence. Gradually, the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill warned of in his famous speech became real. From the Baltic to the Adriatic, an invisible line cut the continent in two, the West leaning toward the United States, the East falling within the Soviet orbit. People in Berlin, Prague, Warsaw, Budapest and beyond felt clearly they were pieces on a chessboard whose main players were Washington and Moscow. For the United States, this was the moment it shifted from a country with a tradition of not deeply intervening in Europe to the role of backer and defender of the free world. It created NATO, a military alliance for collective defense. With one key clause, an attack on one was an attack on all. That forced the United States to maintain troops, bases, and weapons in Europe for decades, on a continent far from its homeland. Parallel to the division of Europe was the rise of another ghost, nuclear weapons. The United States was the first to possess and use atomic bombs in war, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki etched forever in memory. After the war, Washington believed it held an absolute advantage, but not long after, the Soviet Union also successfully tested an atomic bomb, and the two sides plunged into a terrifying arms race from A-bombs to H-bombs, from strategic bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles. The concept of mutually assured destruction appeared if one side launched, the other would retaliate, and the result would be both wiped out, along with civilization. Paradoxically, that very extreme fear made leaders on both sides more cautious about the idea of direct war. They did not want World War III to be humanity's last war. At the global strategic level, the confrontation was missiles, nuclear bombs, and alliances at the level of everyday life. American citizens felt the Cold War in very different ways. In schools, children were taught to duck under their desks during nuclear drills, taking part in duck and cover exercises that seemed strange but were deadly serious. In the suburbs, well-off families built shelters in their yards, stocking canned food and water. Hollywood films, comic books, advertisements, and more were filled with images of the Red Scare, where an invisible enemy could infiltrate every neighborhood and office. Fear of infiltration exploded into a domestic hunt for communists, associated with Senator Joseph McCarthy. Hearings, blacklists, and vague accusations cost many people their jobs and reputations. In this climate, the United States tried to prove itself the beacon of freedom, yet sank into behaviors that made its own citizens question the values they had been proud of. The Cold War was therefore not only a struggle between two blocs, but also an inner struggle within America itself, how to protect security without betraying its democratic ideals. On the front line of this confrontation, Berlin became a symbolic flashpoint. The city was divided into 4 occupation zones after World War II, but lay deep inside East Germany, controlled by the Soviet Union. When Western powers and Moscow clashed over Germany's future, the Berlin Crisis of 1948 to 1949 erupted. The Soviet Union blockaded all land routes into West Berlin, hoping to force the West to back down. The United States responded with a remarkable operation. American and Allied air forces organized a massive airlift, flying thousands of tons of food, coal, and medicine into the city every day. The image of American planes landing one after another, pilots dropping candy for Berlin children, was both military strategy and propaganda. America would not abandon its allies, and America could sustain the free world with both strength and generosity. The Cold War was not just about crises in Europe. Only a few years later, on the Korean Peninsula, the hidden confrontation between the two superpowers flared into open war. The peninsula had been divided after World War II, with the North under communist rule and the South governed by a pro-Western regime. In 1950, North Korean forces launched a surprise attack across the 38th parallel. For Washington, this was the first test of the new containment doctrine. If North Korea unified the country under its flag, would other countries fall one after another? The United States did not stand aside. Under the banner of the United Nations, but with American forces playing the main role, troops landed in Korea, held off fierce attacks, and then counterattacked, pushing northern forces back near the Chinese border. When China sent in volunteer forces, the tide turned again. Brutal winter battles, snow-covered mountains soaked in blood, young soldiers dying in a remote land. All of it showed that the Cold War could erupt into hot war wherever the ideological fault line ran. After 3 years of fighting, an armistice was signed, with no side truly victorious, and the front line almost unchanged. Yet, for the United States, Korea marked a turning point from then on. It would have to keep a large standing army overseas and accept undeclared wars that dragged on for years. If Korea was a test, Vietnam was the deepest wound. From a name few Americans knew, Vietnam became the center of political life in the United States for 2 decades. Strategists in Washington looked at a map of Southeast Asia through the same lens if South Vietnam fell to communism. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia might follow. This was the domino theory. Although reality was more complex, faith in this theory shaped decisions taken by presidents from Eisenhower to Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. At first, the United States sent only military advisors, weapons, and money. Step by step, that involvement escalated. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, Congress gave President Johnson broad authority to use force in Vietnam. American troops arrived in ever greater numbers. Helicopters thundered overhead. Bases sprang up across the South. At the height of the war, more than 500,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. For them, Vietnam was not a country deeply studied in geography class, but a maze of humid jungles, unfamiliar villages, and quiet rivers where every bush could hide danger. American soldiers brought modern rifles, tanks, artillery, aircraft, and massive bombs. Yet they faced an enemy with different advantages: deep knowledge of the terrain, support from villagers, supply lines stretching thousands of kilometers through mountains and forests, and above all, a powerful will to fight. On the battlefield, superiority in technology could not solve political and psychological challenges. For America, each battle won in statistics did not bring it closer to a clear final victory. Meanwhile, the United States itself was changing. Unlike previous wars, the conflict in Vietnam appeared on television screens every evening. Images of American soldiers on patrol, wounded or dead, bodies lifted into helicopters, burning villages, children running in terror, entered the living rooms of millions of households. Each fallen soldier's name read aloud, each coffin draped with the flag returning to a small town, made war less abstract and more painfully real. The anti-war movement surged. On college campuses, students gathered, chanted slogans, and burned draft cards. Singers and songwriters composed protest songs. Journalists and writers challenged the government. Mothers, wives, and sisters of enlisted men marched as well, torn between fear for their loved ones and the question, what are we fighting for? Is this price worth it? Large demonstrations, clashes between protesters and police, and outbreaks of violence shook public opinion. In a sense, the Vietnam War opened another front on America's streets, pitting generations and worldviews against each other. Politically, the war eroded Americans' trust in their government. Leaked documents and investigative reporting showed that officials had at times painted an overly optimistic picture, hid failures, and inflated successes. The Watergate scandal and President Nixon's resignation deepened public skepticism. When the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973 and American forces gradually pulled out of Vietnam, many veterans returned home carrying not only physical wounds, but also unspoken trauma. Unlike the World War II generation, they were not always greeted as heroes. Some faced suspicion or even resentment. The scar of Vietnam lay not only at the national level, but in countless individual lives. Yet the Cold War was not confined to names like Korea and Vietnam. In Cuba, a small island close to American shores, Fidel Castro's revolution brought a communist regime to power just over 100 kilometers from Florida. When the Soviet Union tried to place nuclear missiles there, the world approached the edge of catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was one of the tensest moments in human history. The U.S. Navy encircled the island, and both sides put their missiles on alert. Calls, letters, and careful wording passed between President Kennedy and Soviet leader Khrushchev in an atmosphere where any miscalculation could trigger nuclear war. In the end, they reached an agreement to withdraw the missiles, with secret concessions, avoiding disaster for the United States. The crisis was both a diplomatic victory and a stern warning from then on. Any strategic mistake could cost tens of millions of lives. Beyond Cuba, the United States intervened in countless other hotspots, backing friendly governments in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia to counter movements and groups it saw as communist or pro-Soviet. In many cases, this put Washington in a dilemma to stop the red threat. It supported authoritarian regimes that repressed their own people, seemingly contradicting the democratic values America claimed to uphold. These contradictions fueled long-running debates inside the United States and gave the Soviet Union material to accuse the West of hypocrisy. At the same time, the Cold War spurred a race in science, technology, and culture when the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite and then sent Yuri Gagarin into space as the first human. American pride took a hit. President Kennedy pledged a bold goal: land a man on the moon and return him safely. The Apollo program mobilized hundreds of thousands of engineers, scientists, and workers, and massive resources. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong took the first human steps on the lunar surface, it was not only a NASA triumph, but also a symbolic victory in the competition with Moscow. Americans felt they had proved something: their system could produce technological feats their rival could not easily match. The rivalry extended into sports, arts, films, and propaganda. Olympic Games became venues where each side displayed its system medal counts. Performances and records were read as proof of superiority. Hollywood churned out spy movies and stories about Soviet threats while glorifying a free, glamorous America. Soviet film and media portrayed the United States as imperialist, exploitative, decadent, and violent. In that world, even a book, a performance, a pair of jeans, or a radio could carry political meaning. Domestically, the Cold War helped cement a sprawling military-industrial complex. Arms factories, technology companies, research institutes, and bases meshed tightly with government, creating jobs and profits. Many interstate highways were justified as serving both civilian needs and strategic mobility in wartime. Defense spending consumed a large share of the federal budget, asking citizens to accept higher taxes and debt. At the same time, the Cold War drove investment in science and engineering education as America realized it needed physicists, engineers, and technicians to avoid falling behind. In a twist of history, competition with the Soviet Union also helped spur civil rights struggles inside the United States. Soviet propaganda relentlessly highlighted racial inequality and violence against Black Americans. U.S. leaders realized that without change, the image of a free and democratic America would ring hollow in the eyes of newly independent nations around the world. In the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement surged, with Martin Luther King Jr. and many others demanding equality. The Cold War was not the sole cause, but rivalry with Moscow pushed American elites to confront a hard question: how could they lead the free world while denying full rights to their own citizens? From the late 1960s into the 1970s, after peak crises like Cuba and Vietnam, the United States and the Soviet Union sought a less dangerous way to coexist. The era of détente brought arms control agreements like SALT, high-level visits, and widely publicized summits. Citizens of both countries saw leaders sitting side by side, shaking hands and signing documents instead of only appearing as implacable enemies. Yet détente did not end competition. The two sides kept expanding their arsenals and backing opposing forces in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. The Cold War simply shifted into a quieter but still tense phase. In the 1980s, the balance shifted again. The Soviet economy stagnated under rigid central planning. The long war in Afghanistan drained resources and credibility. Meanwhile, despite its own crises of inflation, oil shocks, and unemployment, the United States had a more flexible market economy. Under President Reagan, Washington ramped up military spending and announced ambitious projects like the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars. Even if parts of SDI were unrealistic at the time, the message was clear: the United States was ready to push the technological race to a level the Soviet Union would struggle to match. In Moscow, leaders such as Mikhail Gorbachev realized that the old course was unsustainable. He launched reforms known as perestroika and glasnost, trying to save the system by opening it up economically and socially. History, however, did not follow his script. Greater openness gave citizens more information and voice, revealing deep dissatisfaction. In Eastern Europe, communist governments loyal to Moscow faced mass protests, strikes, and movements demanding freedom. Allies began to chart their own course instead of automatically following Soviet orders. In 1989, the world watched scenes that had recently seemed unimaginable. The Berlin Wall, symbol of East-West division, was torn down by crowds. People climbed up, sang and danced, smashing chunks of concrete and embracing one another in tears. For Americans, The fall of the wall was not just a German story, but a symbolic victory for everything they had pursued for 4 decades, a united Europe without an iron curtain, with democracy and markets spreading eastward. 2 years later, the Soviet Union formally dissolved, the red flag-bearing hammer and sickle came down, and the new Russian tricolor rose over the Kremlin. The familiar world of 2 opposing superpowers vanished overnight. In the aftermath, the United States entered a new phase. Many believed it had won a war that was never declared, not through a single decisive battle, but through a mix of economic, technological, cultural, and political endurance. Some thinkers spoke of the end of history, suggesting that liberal democracy and capitalism, embodied by America, were humanity's final destination. In Washington, the old obsession with a peer competitor faded, but a new question arose: what would the United States do with unmatched power? In daily life, many Americans felt relief as the specter of nuclear war receded. School drills became anecdotes, maps of missile trajectories gave way to other diagrams. But the Cold War left more than statistics about warheads and treaties. It deeply marked how Americans saw the world and themselves. They had grown used to thinking of their country as a bulwark against communism, and to intervening in distant lands in the name of defending the free world with the old enemy gone. That sense of mission needed redefining. Subsequent wars and interventions, from the Gulf to the Balkans and from Afghanistan to Iraq, all carried traces of mindsets shaped by the Cold War, even though the context had changed. Looking back over the years from 1945 to 1991, the Cold War can be seen as a vast furnace that forged the United States into a comprehensive superpower. It pushed America to weave a network of alliances and bases across the globe. It forced investment in science, technology, and education to prevent being overtaken. It obliged leaders to learn how to blend hard power, military and economic, with soft power, culture, image, and values. Yet it also taught painful lessons that overwhelming military might cannot guarantee political success. As in Vietnam, that fear can drive a society toward dangerous extremes. As in the McCarthy era, that to win the world's trust, the United States must strive to live up to the ideals it preaches. Today, the Cold War belongs to history books, and many of its main actors survive only as faces on old documentary footage. But if we listen closely, we can still hear echoes of that time in modern security crises and arguments over America's global role. U.S. bases in Europe and Asia remain. NATO survives and has even expanded. Debates over defense spending, intervention, and whether America should act as the world's policeman continue. The world has changed profoundly since 1991, but modern America, with all its strength, weaknesses, and contradictions, still carries the deep imprint of 4 decades of Cold War, a time when every major decision in Washington and Moscow could make the whole planet hold its breath.